Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to tell you just a word about myself before I get into the subject matter that I'll be talking to you about today, so you'll understand a little of the context about which I'm going to be addressing in my presentation. I'm a recovered litigator, like a recovered alcoholic. You getting the metaphor here? I spent 50 years litigating cases here in Silicon Valley with a reasonable amount of success over these years with a very well-known and large Silicon Valley firm, as also together with a firm of my own as well. So my orientation over these years, up to the year 2018, has been adversarial, meaning who could win and who could lose in court. Have any of you had an experience in court in your lifetime? Just raise your hand. It's a delightful experience, isn't it? It's a little bit of masochism to go through it in many cases. And the reason is the system is one of an adversarial nature. There's a winner and there's a loser. There's another process that's developed over the years, and that's going to be the focus of my conversation with you today. And that is peaceful dispute resolution through a non-adversarial process, which is what we call mediation. It's a very special process. It means different things to different people. And in presenting my remarks to you, I'm going to draw the distinction. I'm going to define for you the difference between litigation in the adversarial process and mediation, which is a much more consensual process, a much more humane and respectful process, where you don't need a judge to tell you who's right or wrong. And I'll explain a little bit more about that because it has an application around the world. And it relates also not only to human rights, but to the Declaration of the United Nations in the late 1940s, the Declaration of Human Rights, which is a centerpiece of humanism. And if all of you are familiar with this book by Roy Speckhart, this is basically his publication. He's your executive director in Washington, D.C., creating change through humanism. The concepts that I'm going to talk to you about, and I want to introduce them to you briefly at the very beginning, relate very much to the subject matter that I'm going to talk to you about. Specifically, I want to quote from this book because it builds actually on your introduction, your brief introduction this morning. These are some excerpts from Roy's book, and I had the pleasure of meeting, having lunch with him recently, as I expressed my interest in secular humanism specifically. He writes, "The pillar of humanity is empathy. Empathy is the capacity to recognize and share feelings experienced by others." He goes on to say, "It is through the cultivation of empathy that we develop a deep-seated compassion for humankind and the world at large." He then goes on to say, "Being a humanist means seeking to better oneself and society and enjoying the experience along the way." That's an important concept. It's enjoying the journey along the way. Fourth, working to benefit society maximizes individual happiness. Important to all of us in our lifetime, particularly as we get older, but during our lifetime and our younger years as well. And lastly, the quote that I want to reference is, "Humanists have long supported," interesting that he said this because it's actually an integral part of my presentation to you, "supported the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights." He specifically cites that, page 93 of his publication. So how does this relate to what I want to talk to you about? Because the process that I'm going to discuss with you in this brief session this morning, that I've taken around the world through my foundation for rule of law. Literally, tomorrow I'm leaving for the Balkans, for Bulgaria, Croatia, the Republic of Georgia, my third trip there. I've been to India, I've been to Latin America, I've been to Kosovo. The message that I'm conveying in the work that we do, as I'll explain, is that these are important principles: empathy, compassion, reaching an understanding, not only, in fact, to the exclusion of who's right or wrong. The issue is not, in my world, who's right or wrong per se. That's important, But the most important thing is, how do we resolve the conflict in a way that the parties are satisfied and they can go on and live rich and fulfilling lives? And oftentimes in litigation, it's just the opposite. There's a winner, there's a loser, there's somebody who's in great pain, and there's somebody that has a victory, and oftentimes that victory is very expensive, and it can be a Pyrrhic victory. Although at least in my 50 years of litigation, it's been very satisfying on my personal level. It hasn't always been that way for the client that had to go through it. So what I want to do first, if I do this right, is talk to you about the key definitions that we're going to discuss today, and that will relate it to human rights. When I talk about rule of law, or the UN Declaration, or mediation, and the mission of our organization, what are we talking about? Rule of law, what does that mean? We see it written. In fact, I have an article I wrote in Humanist magazine. I have copies up here if any of you want to read it. It was published this past summer. But the bottom line is, what do we mean by rule of law? It means different things to different people. What does it mean in the United States, particularly with what's going on, this craziness that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now? What does rule of law mean in democracy? Well, there's certain things it means that I want to emphasize with you as we talk. First of all, it means that the laws govern all citizens, everybody, whether it's the president or whether it's the janitor cleaning up in a particular building. Everybody is covered by that law. Nobody's exempt from that law. Secondly, it means that everybody is treated equally under the law, and that they're assured, third, fair treatment under the law. Everybody has that guarantee in that society. And fourth, that they're not governed by the whim of some arbitrary bureaucrat in government. That the whim of the government of a particular individual doesn't control your life. The rules apply to everybody equally and fairly, and no government official has the right to do it arbitrarily and obviously in a discriminatory way. And fifth, that you are given advance notice of those rules. They're transparent so that you can guide your conduct and your life in an orderly way. That's the essence of rule of law. It's the essence of what democracy in its best form provides, and that we all struggle for every day to preserve in this country and preserve in other democracies that are very challenged, and I'll talk about that in a moment, around the world. What about human rights? When we talk about human rights, what are the human rights? Well, if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which came about in the late 1940s, there are a whole recitation, many pages of what these rights are. How do they relate to what we're talking about today? When I had my first case in India, and a woman came in who'd been badly beaten and battered in a divorce proceeding into the mediation room, and the husband wanted a divorce, and she didn't want a divorce, because in India, if she goes back to her village and she's been divorced, she's tainted for the rest of her life. So despite the abuse, the physical abuse that she experienced, she opposed the divorce that the husband wanted. Are there any more fundamental human rights than the right to be free of battery, of abuse, mental and physical, to be thrown out of your house into a society, into a place where you have no future happiness, no future security? Yet this came through our mediation center in a piece of family litigation referred by the courts, and I'll talk to you about how that operates here. So that's a very fundamental right that the UN Declaration recognizes. The right to a secure living place, the right to marriage, the right to practice your religion or no religion, the right to property, to own property, and the rights of using the property the way that you want, the rights to privacy. All of these are rights that are laid out in the UN Declaration. And even though when we get these cases in the mediation centers that we work with, that I will describe to you, oftentimes they just come in as a dispute where somebody's making a claim and you don't see the right, so to speak, that's there. And actually I have a handout here of an article I wrote for the American Bar Association, if you'd like to take one, there's some extras here, in which I describe the relationship between dispute resolution generally, that often has an umbrella, a cover of very fundamental human rights. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's what I'm referencing in the UN Declaration. Mediation and litigation. Litigation, you fight, okay? There are two sides, or sometimes more than two, a judge sits there impartially, hopefully honestly, decides who's right, who's wrong, adversarial process. When I was a litigator for 50 years, I had two big fangs that came out. As soon as I got in that courtroom, those fangs came out. And I knew just where that jugular was, and I worked hard for my client to see that I drew blood. We were right, and they were wrong. And I wanted that judge to tell, on behalf of my client, the other side that they were wrong and pay for it. It's an adversarial process. That's an important one in certain cases. Public policy cases of great significance. Constitutional cases, it's important. But it's an adversarial process, and there are winners and there are losers. Mediation. Has anybody here ever been through a mediation in a matter directly? Okay, a couple of you have. And I don't know whether it's been a good and a well-run process, but where it's done properly, mediation is totally different. When I conduct a mediation in this work, the first thing I say to the parties, we are not going to decide today is who is right or wrong. We are going to get beyond right or wrong. We're going to go to a place beyond who's right or wrong, and we're going to figure out how do we solve the problem, putting aside the legalities and the formalities. What's the problem? What is the underlying interest? The example I gave you to the woman that came in that room, beaten and abused, and the husband who didn't want to live with her anymore, the resolution was going to be how does she get security and mental comfort and physical comfort and care for her child, and she can go back to her community in a productive life, in a happy life. And how does he, quote unquote, get rid of her if it's an unhappy marriage? Or how do we reconcile them? It's not just a question of who's right or wrong. We're looking at how to resolve the problem. It's a voluntary process in which the parties have no settlement or resolution unless they voluntarily agree. No judge to say who's right or wrong. No judge to say this is what you're going to do. They have to reach an agreement. And that makes it a very powerful process, as I'll describe to you. And our mission at FSRI, that's the Foundation for Sustainable Rule of Law Initiatives, that's my NGO, for this foundation is that when invited to countries around the world, because of the work that we're known to do, we work with the chief justices of the courts, we work with the mediators, we work with the lawyers, we work with the law ministries, we work with the bar executives or the lawyers who often oppose what we do, as I did when it was first introduced to me in the United States, because I felt it was going to take away my livelihood, my cases, my litigation. I thought ADR, alternative dispute resolution, meant awful diminution of revenue. I was going to lose all my money. So lawyers, and in India, they went on a 6-month strike when we started there and ripped my center apart. Came up and ripped it apart because they didn't understand the process, which is a learning point for me that I'll describe to you a little bit later on. Our mission, on invitation by a host country, is to work with them and teach them to fish. We do not fish for them. We teach them the skills of mediation. We help them set up the center. We coach them when they start handling these cases. In India, we've handled over 200,000 cases since we started working there. Our settlement rate, including family disputes, is over 60 to 65%, which is typical of other places around the world. It's impactful. And you take a country like India with 1 billion people, and you take 200,000 cases that almost always has 4 or 5 people fighting with each other, that's impacting 1 million lives in just one country, in just one NGO and one program. So it's very powerful in terms of its impact. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about it. But our mission is to help them set it up, and then they run it and we leave. And that's what really determines if there's any success here. In the process, can it function? Can it be sustainable after we're gone? So those are some of the concepts that I want to share with you. Just leaving in the air for the moment, what are these special skills that kind of come into play? So, what's the problem that we're trying to address? Backlogged dysfunctional court systems. India, 32 million cases backlogged with 1 billion people. When I got to Brazil only has 250 million people. 1/4 of what India has. How many cases do they have backlogged? 85 million cases. 3 times the amount in India with a much larger population. As you go around the world, much like we had in the United States many years ago, that's been cleared, as I'll talk to you about a little bit later on, Millions of cases in these countries often backlog. What does that mean to people that don't have a lot of money, can't afford to get an attorney, can't afford to pay court fees? It means they are denied access to justice and resolution. It drags on for years and years and years with no resolution to the problem. It's denial of access to justice, peaceful, timely, and dispute resolution. And that undermines the whole concept of a rule of law, a place where people can get justice, people can get access to a ruling or a resolution to their problem. And what do the parties do? They resort to self-help. They bribe. If they can't get a litigation of what their property rights are, they'll bribe a property official to get the permit that they need, or to bribe a government official that will allow them to build the building that they want, or whatever it may be to accomplish the result. They'll engage in extortion. If you don't do X, pay the money you owe me. This thug over here is going to break your fingers until you do, or threaten your family. Thugs will be hired. In Mumbai, it's been written, and this is a book called Maximum City. In Mumbai, for $5, you can get somebody shot. Hire somebody to do it, because if you don't have a belief in the system, this is what happens. And look what's going on in the Philippines right now with Duarte. He's out there shooting people all over the place for his political ends because he's calling them all drug dealers, and they have no access to the courts to protect themselves. There are all too many of these examples around the world. Extortion, thugs, corruption, and then, of course, you've all read about the rapes going on in India and elsewhere around the world. Why are these rapes continuing without any accountability? The reason is, in India, 6% conviction rate of criminal violations. 6%. That means 94% of those crimes committed never hold the criminal or accused criminal accountable. So, of course, anybody who wants to rape, rob, steal, abuse, there's no accountability for it. So you've got to have a system that gives access to people and in a way that they don't engage in this kind of self-help and undermine the concept of a democracy. Civil disobedience, disregard for rule of law, distrust, complete distrust, and a breakdown of respect for the government. Okay, let me go forward here. What is mediation? ADIR is part of the solution. It's efficient, it's peaceful, it's voluntary, it's timely, a form of resolution. It avoids mistrust, destructive self-help, it reduces the court backlog, it promotes the democratic model, and there are some limitations I want to mention to you. What is it that I'm talking about here? In a mediation, a person is skilled. Myself, I've gone through over 100 hours of training before I started mediating and during my mediation experience. You're taught how to bring the parties together in conflict, to meet with them in private caucus, in joint caucus, together and separately, to find out what they're really concerned about. What is the underlying interest that they're really litigating? Oftentimes, it's not just a question of money, particularly in family matters. It's often a question of the relationship, or somebody that feels they've been fired because of their race or their color or their religion or their national origin, or they've been sexually harassed. It's not just a question of monetary damage. It's a question of respect. It's a question of the opportunity to work in a fair and a proper environment, free of discrimination. So you've got to meet with the parties, find out what they really want to get resolved, and then focus them on how do we get it resolved? How do we fix that problem? What do you do when you reach an impasse? And that's usually very early in the mediation, when the parties start knocking heads, and one party is at one extreme from the other party. How do you break that impasse? How do you create options of resolution? How do you allow the parties to determine what they want to resolve their dispute? And somebody that's skilled in mediation, this is where Roy's comments, Speckhart's comments, showing compassion, showing tolerance, showing understanding, what we call active listening in mediation, the ability to really listen to what the person is saying and have compassion, understanding, reinforce what their legitimate objectives are, and reach a resolution is all part of the skills of a mediator. These aren't just picked out of the air. You learn how to expand the pie, find new resolution, how to address the real concerns that are there. And then the trust gets built. And what happens is, when you set these systems up, the courts that have these backlog cases, what they do is they take the cases and they refer them and this is part of what I do overseas. I train judges on how to select the right cases and refer those cases to the mediation centers in such a fashion that the mediation centers can reach the resolution. And once the resolution is reached, what happens is it goes back to the court, and the court enters the voluntary agreement of the parties. The parties are not required to agree to anything they don't want to agree to. They have counsel in the mediation that represent their interests in the mediation. Under the supervision, the oversight of the mediator, they reach a resolution, and then when it goes specifically back to the court, it becomes a court order, it is final, and it is over, it is resolved. And it cannot be litigated any further. So no appeals, 10, 15, or 20 years in the process. So all of this reduces the court backlog as they refer the cases to the mediation centers. It supports the democratic model. Now, there are certain human rights cases when you're dealing with large public policy questions, like we are starting to deal with in this country right now. Questions of constitutional authority, accountability, corruption, questions of constitutional rights. These have to be litigated in most cases, where you need a final determination from the authority, the third branch of government, to determine what the Constitution really requires. And that's a legitimate process that most mediators, public policy disputes, don't get quite as heavily involved in unconstitutional questions. I talk about that actually in my article as well. So we have programs throughout the world, in the United States, and here, I'm going to talk about Northern California. If I were to ask you what percentage of cases that are filed in our federal courts in Northern California, what percentage of those filed ever go to trial? If I asked you 25 or 30 years ago, the answer would be 30 to 35% or more, okay? Since we have introduced mediation in our court system in Northern California, which we have, in fact, it's mandatory. The federal courts in Northern California, it's a wonderful program, and I've been a volunteer mediator there now for over 20 years. They require every single party to at least try some form of alternative dispute resolution. Usually, that's mediation. Okay? They require it. Now, 30 years ago, that was required. It was 30 to 35%. What do you think today is the percentage?
1%.
1%, that low. How low? 7%. And we would try for 10, 15. You're really an optimist, okay? 1%. It's actually, you're not far off. It's less than 2% of the cases.
Wow.
What happens to those cases? They get resolved through another process. And in the cases that really need to be tried, those are the ones that go to trial, and those are the ones that judges need to make a determination because they're sufficiently important. So we've taken, through this system, and reduce the number of cases that go to litigation and get resolution on a very high percentage, even where the parties resisted initially. But when they go into a good mediation process, and I don't know what yours was like, we'll talk about that in the question-answer period, but if they go through a skilled mediator in a good process, it's a wonderful win-win situation. It's not a win-lose, which makes a great deal of difference. We have programs like that set up in India, starting at a place in India. The first place that we were invited by the Chief Justice, my wife and I moved to India for 2 months to set up the first center in a place called Tisazari. The Chief Justice, Justice Sagarwal of the Indian Supreme Court, the top justice, and he took me to, or one of his representatives took me to one of the mediation center. 4 floors, 200 judges, monkeys running around all over the place, defecating. Okay, people waiting in lines all over the place, monkeys biting people, stealing their food, grabbing things from packages that were around. And I said, Chief, this is where you want me to set up the first center? Can't you give me a little better shot? And he said, Mr. Victor, they can never pronounce my name as well as you did in the introduction. They can never do that. Mr. Victor, if you can do it here, then we can show India we can do it everywhere. And he was right. And we did it there. And that center is still functioning quite well today, handling a great number of cases. And then we did it in Bangalore, and then we worked with people in Chennai, and then we went to Chandigarh and other places, in Kerala, in southwestern India. And there are functioning programs that are going on in that area, working very, very well. So through India, there are challenges. We'll only talk about those if you raise the questions, but it's functioning and sustainable. South America, in Rio, one of the best programs, Mariana de Sousa, someone I've had the pleasure to work with, runs a program called the CBMA, which is basically the Brazilian Center for Mediation and Arbitration. And I just met, actually, in a speech I gave at Harvard a couple of weeks ago, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India, and he is embracing the concept also of alternative dispute resolution and mediation centers. We're seeing it grow there. The Balkans, I told you about, I'm going for my third time tomorrow. And I got to tell you, the mindset in these countries, the mindset, when I go to Croatia, I say, now if you want to make peace with your enemies, this is what we want to set up these mediation centers. I say, excuse me, Mr. Victor, I get from all the lawyers, we don't want to make peace with our enemies, we want to kill our enemies, okay? That's the kind of a mindset, oftentimes, out of a country and a culture that's had so much civil war and brutality, rapes of their families, families burned in their homes alive through some of these civil disputes. How do you move them? How do you change that mindset? Well, I'll leave that to some of your questions. We'll talk a little bit about, but we've got many programs that are going there with some wonderful leaders in the Republic of Georgia, in Bulgaria, in Croatia, and other countries. And I started to get involved a little more in Africa. My wife and I have been to Africa to safari 6 times, but I went there once last year to Liberia, a country also racked by all kinds of civil dispute. And we actually got some money from the World Bank and set up a project that was very successful in terms of what our goal was, but they're having real trouble getting it sustainable because they're not getting sufficient support from a lot of their key stakeholders and leaders, and it's one of the challenges we have. But we train mediators, we set up a center, and we've got the support of the judges. Now we've got to get them to really embrace it going forward, so that's been a little bit of a challenge. Okay. What role do we play? We focus on, at FSRI, the Foundation for Sustainable Rule Initiatives, our NGO, on building quality, sustainable mediation centers run by the host nations. We do not run the programs. We teach them how to run the program. We train the mediators. We set up the systems. We show them how to keep the data. We oversee it with repeated visits, and then we leave, and then we monitor it over a period of time. We do it in 3 stages. The first is we go and we do an assessment. We visit the country and see what dispute resolution processes they already have in existence, and we build on their systems if they work and make them stronger, or we create new systems. That's the assessment phase. We make recommendations. Then we return if we're invited, and so far we've been invited back, not always with unanimity, but we have been invited back. And the second phase is we implement the recommendations that they accept, and then we do a quality review over a period of time to review the progress of the program and see whether or not they're being effective. And the key, of course, is a cultural tailoring of the systems and the design. What we want to do, and I'm going to give you an example of this, is we really want to determine what in that culture works. When you go to a country like Bulgaria, where they may ask you, or was in Croatia actually, I said, we don't want to make peace with our enemies. We want to basically have a judge come in, pound them on the head, tell them they were wrong, throw them in jail, rip off their nails one at a time on all 10 fingers. Then we have to understand there's a culture of history and sometimes hate that needs to be put in a new environment, and we have to set up a system to work. And I'll give you a very specific example, which I think you'll find instructive. In India, have any of you been to India? Anybody here? Okay. So if you've been there, you know that India is primarily an agricultural society, notwithstanding all the modern Bangalore and Hyderabad and everything else. 75% of the country is basically village. In almost every village is what's called the panchayat. Panchayat means 5. So when I went to India the first time as a student in 1964, I met Chairman Kampai in a little village, and he was the chairman of the panchayat. It's 5 people. They met under a tree at the corner of the village, and the villagers would come with respect to their elders, and they would present their dispute, and they would then decide how to resolve the dispute. It was a form of mediation that we didn't call mediation. And where it is not corrupted, and there's an issue of corruption in India with the panchayats, but where it is run as it should be run historically, it's a very effective mediation system. So when we went to India to design the system, I spoke to them about the positive qualities of the panchayat, and we designed our program on the model of the panchayat method of getting resolved. That meant it wasn't an American coming, a foreigner, to tell them this is the way they should do it. It was building on their wisdom, on their system. And whether you go to China or Latin America or any place you go, there are systems that you can build on. So we culturally tailor that design in such a way that it can be successful. And unfortunately, many of our government programs go in with the American model. It works while they're there, and then when they leave, it collapses. Under a lot of our own programs that we bring from the United States, our concept is to go there and design it in a way they can embrace it, and it can be sustainable. So that cultural tailoring is a critical role that we play to design and do that training. So our mission, I won't read all of this to you, and there's more about this in the material if you want, is to create alternative dispute resolution centers to achieve timely, fair, and peaceful conflict resolution in emerging countries with overburdened and backlogged court systems. We formed our NGO, our charitable organization, in 2012 to work and develop global expansion of mediation institutions to assure peaceful, timely, and fair resolution in countries with heavily backlogged cases. And, of course, these cases that I've described to you can literally go into millions of cases. So what are some of our challenges that we deal with? I want to share this with you as I kind of close out. And by the way, before I close out, I'm going to show you one of these centers. I want you to see what it looks like from the 1,000 monkeys running around, defecating all over the place, no windows, monsoon rains, washing the garbage through the floors, okay? Occasionally, what did we see on the back wall, if I'm not mistaken? What did you see, Jan? There were rats running. I was giving a speech to a group of judges, and there were rats running across the back of the hall. And I'm noticing my wife, her eyes are like wide open. She's there with my son. And then I saw this thing running around. It was going after the cookies that were in the back that were going to be served. And there aren't any around here, so we're safe. But we have to watch for all these things. Anyway, as we look at all of these kinds of things, there are challenges, and I want you to see what the centers look like. But the future overall is positive, although the collateral impact of the Trump administration and our isolation is really hampering our efforts. Because there are so many judiciaries that you've read about now that are being challenged in Poland, in Hungary, in the Philippines, that are independents are being challenged by people that are autocrats. My article in the Humanist magazine, a copy of which is up here if you want to see it, addresses this. We need more rule of law and less inclination to autocracy. This is making our work harder because these countries now are reluctant to try new systems where they're trying to stay alive. In a relationship, we want to make sure people understand in mediation they're also touching upon human rights, to make them aware of it. We've got to watch these political shifts to the right, which basically are more autocratic, more dictatorial in their nature, a la what we're seeing with Orban in Hungary, Duarte in the Philippines, and so forth. We've got to see a more tolerant openness to try these methods of dispute resolution. And then the mindsets of the lawyers. So I'll just tell you, digress for a second as I close this out. And the mindset of the lawyers. So I have about 200, 300 lawyers sitting in a room, and I've been introduced by the president of the Bar Association. Mr. Schachter is going to talk to you about the benefits of mediation. And I get pushback like you can't believe. What am I going to do for a living? I'm going to lose all my money. Who are you to take this work away from me? And by the way, the judges themselves, when I speak to the judges, 32 million cases backlog, they're opposing it initially. Why? They don't want to lose control of the case. They feel they're the ones that should dispose justice, not these so-called mediators. Who are they to do all of this? And they feel they're worried about their job security. In Brazil, with 85 million cases backlogged, they're worried about job security. So you have to deal with something that is irrational in a very much a humanist way, in a rational and scientific way, and approach them what the value is of setting these systems up. So we have to watch for those hostile mindsets. And in India, as I said, we forgot to bring the lawyers in when I first got involved there, and they were so upset. All their clients were coming to the mediation center. They would bring their lawyers, but the lawyers didn't know what to do because they weren't trained and how to represent a client in mediation, which is different than litigation. So they came in, they ripped the whole center up. And I got a call from the High Court Justice, in Delhi at the time, Vic, don't go down to the mediation center because they're ripping it apart. I don't think you do too well down there. And I went down to the mediation center, and sure enough, they were chanting, "Get the foreigners out," and there were signs in red, kind of dripping reddish blood down, keep the foreigners out of here, because they felt threatened. And the mistake that we and I made at that time is we didn't bring the bar in early on to buy into the process and understand how we have learned here in the United States, lawyers can make a great deal of money handling mediation together with litigation and can be very, very successful, which is a fact. And that's something we spend time with. And then we deal with stakeholder buy-in and opposition. So, let me show you, before I open up to your questions, so we stay in time here, I want to show you just one of the centers. This is the Bangalore Mediation Center. First we did the FSRI in Delhi. Am I blocking your view? Okay. First we did FSRI in Delhi, and then we did a place called Karkarduma, which is another location. It was a very successful center outside of Delhi. And then the Chief Justice of the High Court, the highest official in like the state of Karnataka, which houses Bangalore, invited us to come down, the organization I was working with at that time. As all, by the way, all this is voluntary. I want you to understand, none of us are paid. I'm not paid. I've never derived a dime from this. This is my privilege at the end of 50 years of litigation to do this work. And the people who go with me all are very successful in their careers as lawyers, mediators, or specialists in their field in construction or family law. And they come, they volunteer their time, and they pay their own way, but for a very small reimbursement that I can give to them. So all of this is on a voluntary basis, which is another reason we're trusted in these countries, because they know we're not there for a profit motive. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just we come because our hearts as well as our minds are focused on doing this good work, which we view as a privilege. And this is one of the centers that has been one of our greatest successes. Take a look at this center. This is the entryway. No monkeys, no animals, parking space for the judges. People are greeted in Asia the Balkans, which is the Temple of Justice. This is one of the first centers, certainly was the first one there. This is Lila Lopali, a dear friend of my wife and I. She's the daughter of a Supreme Court Justice. She's one of the best mediators, now has a private mediation center, as well as doing their public voluntary work. Look at where they're coming in. It's a busy place. People are coming in with their cases. This is on a typical Saturday afternoon. And look at the facility they're going to. Rooms. Mediation room 1, mediation room 2, separate places to meet, an opportunity to exchange and to get the assistance of a trained mediator. Look at this waiting room. Clean, place to sit. On the wall is actually a video we put up which describes what the mediation process is to remove the fear and anxiety of many uneducated or in some cases illiterate people as well as sophisticated people. And there's actually a quote from Mahatma Gandhi in which he talks about the value of compromise and resolution, which has become very famous now in India and our mediation centers. But a civilized, respectable way to meet. What about the kids? What do you do with the kids when the families are fighting, the mothers and the fathers and the uncles and the sisters and the brothers? Well, one of the ideas that came up from one of the mediators, why don't we set up a nursery? We could put the children, and then the family could focus on getting resolution. And that was a great innovation. That was not my idea. We learned so much from the culture and the people that we meet with. It was theirs. And then this, which you would take for granted, like we have here, a private room with walls to deal with a marital dispute. This happened to involve a Muslim marital dispute. And that's one of the mediators that we trained in our center. And that is a private room, privacy, which they're not accustomed to, a chance to actually focus on their dispute. 2 signs on the wall, up on that wall, you can't read it here. It says, number 1, no, it's free, no charge. They are not charged for this service. And the second sign says, if you settle this case, then we will return your court fees, which to them can be a good deal of money to people who don't have a lot of money. And that was something we got the courts to buy into and allow us to do. This case was resolved in 3 sessions of 2 hours each. This is a justice of the court and myself at the Baylor Mediation Center. Please try mediation in both Kannada, which is the language in Karnataka, and then in English, with this particular justice, who was the president. Manjunath was his name, and he was very much supportive of the program, and we got to develop quite a friendship over the years. And then there was a whole ceremony. I got that little hat and I have it in my house. My wife doesn't give me any more respect because I wear the hat. I find that out. It works in India, but it didn't work here. But it was a lovely ceremony in which they recognized these were mediators that I trained, and there was a shawl and obviously a bit of a Raj's hat to acknowledge the work that had been done. So, if we take a look at some of the guiding principles that I want to share with you, and then open up to your questions. A very special person in my mind who has been an incredible motivator to all of us in the United States, Martin Luther King. An individual is not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Very compelling thought, isn't it? The ultimate measure of a man, I'll modernize this, of a man or a woman, is not where he or she stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands at times of challenge and controversy. I always think of those of us that have accumulated some wealth. It's easier to give money when you have a lot of to give. Not that you take away from the value of it, but it's even more to be acknowledged when there's people who give and don't have a lot to give to support these good works. And I think these phrases really capture a good deal of it. So, with that, let me open up to your questions. I think that will be consistent with the time frame, and then we'll answer those questions.
Okay, so I'll bring the microphone around. I'll try to touch everybody in order. Right now, 3 hands up right away. Remember, hold the mic very close to your mouth. Very close. Almost swallowing it. Okay.
Question about the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
Would you expect me to follow Adolf Trump's laws? You know, there are many, many stupid laws.
Right.
Now, where are you going to draw the problem?
Yeah.
Furthermore, another thing, you've got millions of people involved. So I would think that'd be suicidal.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll give you much too short an answer. We'll obviously have a chance to talk during the break. Good question. And I'm assuming this is on mic. I don't have to repeat the question. It can be heard. Okay. So what if the rule of law is not what it should be, and the rules actually, let's put aside Mr. Trump for the moment. That's a whole separate session of discussion. Okay? But you're right. We are challenged in this country, and the rule of law, to the extent it becomes a rule of one executive, or an executive in disregard of the other branches of government, the legislature, which is now being fought out with the whole Mueller report, and the judiciary, which is obviously reviewing everything from census to God knows whatever else is out there. Well, whatever is out there knows what else. I got to be very careful about my reference, whether one sees it theistically or otherwise. In terms of all of this, the democratic process is one that if we don't like the way it is, we can bring about change. Not right away, but we can bring about change. That's what the elections are about. And we've got to fight for those principles and make sure the elections obviously are non-corrupted. We deal with interference of other countries. We did interfere with other countries over the years. Take a look what we did in Chile years ago, okay? We have a lot to learn in this country about what's right. So we have to get those democratic systems to work for us effectively. And it happened in the midterm elections. Clearly, there are a lot of Trumpians that are either out of office or reined in. We'll see what happens in 2020 and who the Democrats can put out. And hopefully, he will be a decent candidate, not only because of Trump, but because we as a country need to have voices of reason, voices that recognize climate change, voices that recognize the need for health care. All of these things are important. So we have still a process, not immediately, but a process every 4 years and every 2 years with respect to Congress that we can exercise our rights and bring about change. We can't do it sitting in our chairs. Our program is one to help do it internationally. There are many good programs here in the United States and many ways to get the vote out, and that's what we need to do. But you're right, it's in danger, and that's what my article talks about that I wrote for American Humanist Association. It is being threatened now, but we have to exercise our right. And I'll leave you one positive note on this. We've been through this before in this country. Woodrow Wilson was a disaster. He was a racist of the worst kind. He basically said no blacks in government. You can go back further to Andrew Jackson, what he did with the American Indians, to Native Americans. We have a history of some terribly racist presidents that have done some terrible things, and we've survived that. And I think we can do it here so long as we are not apathetic.
What if he gets reelected?
Well, that's a different question. We'll let others, hopefully that will not be the case to those who want a little more moderate view. I'll give others a chance to ask questions. Yes.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about emerging countries, and I looked and thought, and I said, well, what about the ones that have been around for a long time? What about China,
Okay.
for example? And it seems that they might be a lot more set in their ways as
Right.
far as what is or is not going on with them as far as litigation, dispute resolution.
Another good question. So what about other countries, not necessarily just emerging companies, but countries like China with massive populations? Where do they stand right now? Interestingly enough, China actually has developed a very, if you look at it on paper, under their constitution and in their judicial system, they have mediation centers. I have not worked in China. I've met a number of the Chinese justices, and I've certainly worked with people in Singapore and other places around China proper. They actually have a people's mediation series of courts, which are functioning quite well. The problem is that if anything touches upon the countrywide policy of a dictatorship, that is basically crushed. And that's where the problem is. There is not a rule of law as we know it in a democratic society, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, in India, we've got problems in India. The current leadership in India is not squelching the nationalism that has resulted in racist riots against Muslims, against Hindus, and you need leadership from the government to support these systems, otherwise it will collapse. So the answer is it's a continuing struggle, but even within these countries we're seeing change. And in India, one of the reasons we saw massive change is that there's a growing middle class in those countries. The middle class used to be in that country maybe 5%. It is now 15% and growing. 15% of a billion people is what, if my math is somewhere right, it's like, it's about over 100 million people, all right? And they are starting to say, as a woman, I don't want to be sexually harassed. As a Hindu, I don't want to be beaten because I'm not a Muslim. And as a Muslim, I don't want to be beaten or abused because I feel a certain way about eating meat and all the rest of this business that's going on. And they are saying this has got to stop, and it's becoming a very powerful voice. So the bottom line is, it is changing, I think, through education, through promoting the principles very much by the humanist societies that we see, a belief in empirical data, a belief in rationality and rational systems, a belief in compassion for people who are underserved. I think all of that is coming together. Maybe it will not happen all in a lifetime, but people that are dedicated to this work and work like we are doing, I think, are helping to make that change. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. How are you people doing in Israel-Palestine?
Wow.
How are you negotiating your position? You've been doing that for 20 years.
Yeah, okay, so we have not, the question for those of you that may have heard, what's happening in Israel and Palestine? I'm very unhappy to report I've done no significant work in that part of the world. There are other groups that are, okay? I will say only briefly about what's going on there, because there is an autocracy, definitely, that's emerging even stronger and stronger with Mediation and all that's going on there. And if any of you have any sense and have read as well as experienced what's going on with the Palestinians, there's a form of colonization that's going on there that's absolutely horrific. And we have now a third generation that's coming out of these refugee camps. They're going to come out so bitter and so angry that it almost guarantees a violent consequence to us, as we're seeing in Gaza right now. We do not have stakeholders in Israel that we can go and work with at the present time. And what I've learned over the years, in India, we had to wait about 10 years, this is before I was involved, before we got a Chief Justice that understood the value of it. Sometimes you just have to wait, because if you go in and the system doesn't invite you, it's not going to remain. So there are groups on a one-to-one basis. There's some terrific groups working with YWCA, for example, face-to-face, person-to-person groups that are working individually. But the governments right now, I am not aware of any support internationally of an international mediation initiative that we can set up our approach. But it's something that we hope to work with. It's going to take some work. Yes, is there another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you said about 65% of your cases you succeed.
Yes,
So there's about 35 you don't.
that's right.
Can you outline what you think are the reasons some succeed and some do not?
Yes, okay, sure. I'll do that briefly. Very good question. The ones that are most likely to succeed are family-related cases in most countries. Now, when I say family-related cases, I'm not just talking about divorce and custody, because oftentimes in India, in Brazil, even in the Balkans, many families also own businesses together. So if there's strife in the marriage, there's strife about the business, there's strife about property, there's strife about profitability of the businesses and all the rest. So those cases tend to be the best ones that can tend to be resolved. The ones that are the most difficult, frankly, to resolve are the cases that aren't subject to a monetary resolution. Monetary matters are a question usually of a good mediator can bring a negotiation, a facilitated negotiation will get it resolved. But sometimes people, where their pain is so great that they have experienced something so personally horrible, they're not mentally prepared to resolve. Those are the cases that are very difficult to resolve. And usually what we do there is, if we don't resolve in the first session, we'll schedule something later on for a later session. And sometimes we send them back to court, they have a bad experience, the court doesn't resolve it, or it does resolve it, but it doesn't really resolve their underlying pain that they're feeling. For example, in the case of a racial discrimination discharge of a person from work, or discrimination against somebody because of the wrong caste, some arbitrary form of discrimination, it's not just a question of money, it's a question of self-respect. It's a question of being able to earn a decent living and have decent housing in their lifetime. And I want to give you one example of what I'm talking about, which I hope addresses your question. I know too briefly because of the question. There was one matter that was under litigation. It was a family, the grandchildren, 2 generations later, were litigating a case over a piece of property, a large piece of property that was bequested by the dying grandparent to 2 families. One family wanted to turn the property into a business to make money instead of a business. The other family, which had inadequate housing, wanted to have the house and the property to have a decent place to live. And they've been fighting in the courts for over 15 years. I think it was over 20, actually. The grandchildren were fighting about it. And it was getting appeals and litigation, and nothing was getting resolved. A classic example of where right and wrong isn't the answer. We brought this case into mediation. And let me tell you the resolution we came up with. We divided the house. Part of the house and the property was to be a living quarter for the family that wanted to do that. The other part of the house had to be reconstructed at a cost to turn into a business. The party that was living in the house agreed to help to pay for the reconstruction of the business. In return, if the business generated profit, the people that were living in the house as residents get part of the profit, reimburse them for the money that was spent for the reconstruction and for future profits in the business. So we divided the property to both uses. The family, something a court would never be able to do, reconcile the 2 families, reconciliation. That's something we can do in mediation. Is you have a business dispute, you get a resolution, you continue to work with your customer or whoever your manufacturer or producer is. You can work a reconciliation. They did it between these 2 families. So it's being creative and looking for these kinds of resolutions that you can't get in a court. And we kind of feel everything, intellectual property, commercial disputes, but family disputes are the biggest and most prominent percentage of those cases. Very tough cases. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned like the lawyers are having a big problem with this.
Yeah.
But then you said that they could actually make more money doing it.
Right.
So how do they do it? Especially like since you said that showed the image of the people in the room and it said it was all free and like you get reimbursed court fees and stuff like that. So how does that work if it seems to be so much cheaper to do?
Very good question. And this is the greatest skepticism of lawyers or people involved in the legal system. And let me explain. In the mediation, lawyers come and represent their clients. So when you go to a mediation, you don't just show up I don't know if that was your experience or not, but in the mediations that I deal with, certainly professionally here in Silicon Valley, as well as those in developing countries, the parties come with a lawyer. So before you get to the mediation, the parties have to submit briefs to the mediator. Each party submits a factual statement of their position, a legal statement of their position, and the proposed resolution. A lawyer has to do that for their client, just like you would do in court, okay? But it's a much more efficient process with a lawyer. It's not through motions and formal legal practice and formal rules of evidence. Then they have to prepare their client to be able to speak for the client and have the client speak effectively in the mediation. That's a separate skill from you going up and examining witnesses in a formal court proceeding, but you're paid for that. And then if they reach an agreement, you've got to draft the agreement, you have to oversee the enforcement of the agreement. And I will tell you, based on my own personal experience, I'll tell you two things that will be more convincing than in this explanation. One is that in every case that I handled in mediation for clients that I've worked over the years, I was paid exactly the equivalent of my hourly rate because it was so valued by the clients. And I'm going to give you one illustration of why. We had two companies ready to kill each other, two CEOs. They would litigate $10 million to destroy the other side. Highly competitive environment, each accusing the other of stealing company secrets, stealing company personnel, undermining, hacking their systems, and all the rest. And they were ready to go in and fight and spend millions of dollars in fees. In the mediation that was conducted, we brought those two CEOs in. They came up and they entered into a joint venture agreement in which they combined their two companies to a third company. And that third company today is operating, making more money than either of their respective individual companies. No court can do something like that. And then we were able to do that by building trust, coming up with options, showing profitability. And the attorneys that were in that room, their fees didn't mean a whit. It was nothing compared to what it would be if they had gone to litigation. Fact number two, the largest ADR, mediation arbitration organization in the world, last year, the revenues of that organization were over $250 million. $250 million. Okay, that's just one organization, but all worldwide. And in every one of the cases they handle, there are lawyers representing the clients. They got to be making a hell of a lot of money, I got to tell you. So these two facts reinforce what my experience has been, is that our clients appreciate when we go to mediation rather than litigation and get them a resolution in a business or a family or an employment matter. They're grateful for it, and they will go to it quickly, and they'll also recommend you to other clients. And that's how it ends up being a very productive exercise. Yes, sir.
So I have a similar question, actually. I guess in the U.S., as you just said, quite often mediation doesn't involve the government. It's a lawyer in a small business.
A private dispute, right.
Right. So you seem, in your NGO seems to interact with the government of these countries to set up mediation. Why not just let it all be private? Have private mediators.
Right. So the answer to your question is, you're right on. And indeed, in these countries, what we're seeing, and I think the future, this really talks to a future vision I have, it is going to be private mediation in these countries more than it's going to be the court-referred program. Because the courts can only do so much. And what we're finding now in India, I'll just give you an example. Remember the person that Lila Lopali I pointed out, the daughter of Supreme Court Justice? She has set up what's called CAMP, which is the Center for Advanced Mediation Practice. It's a private, for-profit mediation center. And obviously not everybody can afford, although she's not expensive, can afford to pay for that. Those people that can't afford can go to the public court referral. So you want to give those people access to dispute resolution. And those that can afford can go to the private centers. And I think the future in these countries, particularly Brazil, is in a terrible economic situation right now, and it also has an autocrat in this new president, Bolsonaro, is another example of somebody that's kind of running ramrod over democratic principles. But the bottom line is, people will go to their lawyers for these mediation opportunities, either in the private mediation center more to get resolution if the courts don't clear up, and even if they do, as we see in the United States, we're still going. My clients at my law firm before I left would call and say, 10 years ago, they'd say, we want the bulldog litigator that's going to rip the guts out of the other side and win this case. Now they call, and they said, before I left for the last several years, they say, who knows mediation, who can get this into mediation, and who can represent me in mediation? And then they say, give me examples, send me to other clients that used you for that purpose. As a private lawyer, and I was doing far more mediations representing clients, not as a neutral now, this is before I was doing neutral work, than I was doing court litigation. And the judges now are fighting, many of the judges are fighting over cases because the trial level is just dropped down in the federal courts here. They're delighted to get a case where they can actually be judging. And we're delighted not to have them judging if we get these cases resolved. But they appreciate all the work that's being done. Private mediation, for profit, is the future as these countries develop. Sir?
I thought you were going to show us slides of all the monkeys in the room.
You know, but none of you have asked me. None of you have asked me. How'd you get rid of the monkeys? Radiation. You said radiation? Oh, mediation. No. Let me tell you, these monkeys, you've all probably seen monkeys. If you ever see a small monkey, a squirrel, even a squirrel monkey snarl, and those teeth come out, have you ever seen that? Yeah, they got a little thing. Well, what we did. Now, anybody want to tell me what the solution was? Because I had no course in law school and said, how do you get rid of the squirrel monkeys that we used to? Huh? You can dentistry, right? Take their teeth out. No. There are too many of them. All right, so see, none of you came up with this idea. I didn't come up. I wasn't smart enough. But one of my judges did. He got big monkeys. He got, not gorillas, but he got langur monkeys. Have you noticed again? Langur monkeys are about the size of a standard poodle. Looks like a standard poodle. And when they show those fangs, I'm telling you, even my few hairs will stand up at them. They are scary. So we brought them in, 4 of them, on a leash, okay, with a trainer, and those squirrel monkeys disappeared within 1 week. They were gone, and we got rid of the monkeys. And we just kept the langur monkeys there. We fed them the right kind of food, particular area. That's right. Otherwise, if we had difficult people like in this audience, we just fed them to the langurs. Do we have time for another question or not?
Yeah, we do. I have a question since no one else. Does anyone else want to have a question on? The question I had was going way back to the beginning of your talk. You talk about that woman who was abused in India. How did that get resolved by the family? Just curious.
That's a very good question. Now, I'll end with this because I think you'll appreciate this anecdote. Indians in Asia have an incredible capability to both transmit and receive at the same time. Okay, what I mean by that is you will get in these disputes, like this dispute with this woman, this divorce proceeding. We had 16 people in the room, and they were arguing. And the room was 1/3 the size of this room. I think it was suffocatingly hot. Okay, and they are yelling at each other and talking. And obviously, they can't even hear each other, but they have this ability to argue and listen at the same time. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. So I get into this room, and it's going like crazy, and I think, well, how am I going to deal with it? And by the way, it's supposed to be in English, but it really goes to what we call English. It quickly turns to Hindi, okay, because of the comfort level with their own language. I'll tell you what we did. We broke up the session. We had private caucuses with each family. And of course, the woman and the husband and the brother were both on criminal charges for the abuse towards the woman. So they were about to be thrown in jail, and they still wanted to insist that she's thrown out of the house. We stopped the session. We went to the community. We met with the chairman of the village he came from. We called the key community members. We said, look, if we can accomplish A, B, C, and D, will you accept this and accept this woman back into the community and support her transition in the community? And that involved a place for her to live, maintenance payments, and appropriate custody relationships. We proposed to them what we had in mind. They got the community to say, we will support this resolution if you can get it. And then we went back. They were divorced. We supported divorce because we did not think it could be reconciled in a positive way. She got maintenance payments. They came up with custody arrangements, and we got housing for her while she was employed back in the village. And when I went back, and that time I was going back about every 5 to 6 months to India, that deal was signed off. It went to the court. It was enforced as a judgment. The criminal proceedings were dropped, and it was enforced the last several times that I had been there to check on it. That's how we got it resolved. Only in mediation could you do. You could never, ever do that in a court proceeding.
Why?
Because the role of courts is to determine who's right or wrong. They're not there to settle cases. The role of a judge is to say, under the law, that's what the charge of a judge is. Under the law, this is what the law says yes you can do or that you cannot do. Now, they will engage in settlement discussions, but courts don't have the staff and skill themselves to resolve the case as a judge. But what they do is they set up programs like we have in the Northern District where we as volunteers are brought in to handle those cases. And it's through mediation that it's done, not through a judge saying who's right or wrong, except if it goes to trial.